Okay, so this is part four of my series on propaganda. And here we will draw it all together. This is the last part, and analyze a specific episode in the deployment, the execution of propaganda strategy. And what I would like you to keep in mind, I guess, throughout this whole presentation of this episode is that this is not a conspiracy theory. For one thing, this is all in declassified CIA documents. This is public information. This is not outrageous. This is how it works. Okay, this is not exceptional. This is not some kind of abuse on the part of any group. This is how it works. This is how things are done. You could find dozens of other examples of the same sort of thing, and so it will exemplify how the public is manipulated, utilized, even just made into an accessory to the goals of both big government and big business, to the benefit of both, because both are, in a sense, the same entity. So, with that said, we'll get going on the last episode here. So, we're going to talk about United Fruit Company versus Guatemala. So, the United Fruit was an American company, and bringing in fruit, obviously, to the United States. And they would bring in bananas, in particular, from Guatemala, hence the name that you've probably heard of, the Banana Republic. So they were making most of their money by bringing in fruit and basically owning lots of farmland in Guatemala. They controlled the all of the banana plantations in Guatemala. So this is about Guatemala, bananas, and an American corporation. So everything was going well, not necessarily for Guatemala, but for United Fruit Company and for the United States. And here's the setting in Guatemala. It was ruled since 1930 by General George Ubico. He was supported by U.S. military through military bases established there. It's kind of that agreement that we tend to have with a lot of countries where we will, give them a hand, provide aid, beneficial policy, at least to the leader, at least to the person who makes decisions. And the fewer people who make decisions, the better. That's why kind of have a bad reputation of supporting military dictators or dictators in general, because self-governing populations with a very advanced political system don't always do what is in our interests. And so this is the arrangement that we tend to have so that we can have military bases there. So this general was also supported by United Fruit, who had hundreds of thousands of hectares of land to produce bananas, bring them to the United States. But then, disrupting this beautiful relationship was the 1944 October Revolution. People overthrew his military regime, and they were going to hold their first elections. So, you would think, in theory, as Americans, that's awesome. That's wonderful. They're going to hold their first elections. They've been liberated from a dictatorship, and they're going to become a democracy. And, that should be wonderful, right? And this is where you start to get a view of what we really appreciate, as opposed to the rhetoric, which again is mostly propaganda. That rhetoric about self-government is really heavily laden with attitude and not so much actual practicing of what is preached. So as a result of their elections, Um, Juan Jose Arevalo became the first democratically elected president of Guatemala. So there's a revolution. All of the United States and United Fruit Company's relationships with Guatemalan leadership are disrupted, and a new democratically elected president comes in. So he implemented reforms, presumably for the benefit of his people. He was a democratically elected official, after all. He implemented universal suffrage, which means everyone getting to vote. He increased education funding. He implemented minimum wage laws so that workers couldn't be exploited. Then in 1950, his role was taken over by Jacobo Arbenz, who continued his policies and increased land reforms. The problem began when Arbenz expropriated the unused holdings of United Fruit. So if in order to understand what that means, is that if United Fruit controls lots of land, thousands of hectares of land in Guatemala, not all of it was used. And we see that everywhere, land speculation, and it's often used to increase scarcity and to exclude any competition. So a foreign company, United Fruit, had lots of unused land. So it wasn't necessarily land that United Fruit was using to produce bananas and provide jobs or anything like that. So those kinds of justifications aren't valid. It was unused land. So it served no legitimate economic or social purpose in Guatemala for Guatemalans. It was purely to the benefit of United Fruit. So he takes that unused land and gives it to landless debt slaves to till for sustenance. In other words, gives it to poor people and says, you can make this soil productive. Do something on it. Take care of yourselves. Gives them land to work and throws his own land into the pot. Sounds wonderful. Good for Guatemalans, in fact, but disastrous for United Fruit Company. Meant they lost their land monopoly, their complete control of the banana economy in Guatemala. So they lost control of a foreign economy. And so that's a problem. So enter Bernays. United Fruit happens to be one of Bernays' largest clients. He understands that it cannot be about United Fruit versus the self-government of another nation. It has to be about something that is, horrifying to Americans, and so that's communism, obviously. So this is the 1950s. Because, in other words, it's one of those situations, again, we've talked about propaganda enough now that you should know that you can never talk about the thing that you're actually talking about. If he went out and tried to convince the Americans that, allowing United Fruit to overrule the wishes of a foreign government who was trying to take care of its own people for the sake of self-government and democratically elected leaders, and that we were trying to get rid of that because it didn't benefit us economically, no one's going to support that, because that's what Americans are supposedly about. We would want to see, we say in rhetoric that we want other countries to take care of themselves and implement democratic elections. So he couldn't say that. He had to make it about something else, which, again, in that little video of Thank You for Smoking, where he's talking about freedom and liberty and choice instead of about chocolate-flavored ice cream, Bernays makes it about communism. So he brings journalists to Guatemala to meet with politicians. You can bet that there was bribery involved, what we Americans call lobbying. You'll notice that in America, we don't talk about bribery anymore. It doesn't really exist because we took that age-old crime for which people used to be severely punished, and we just changed the name. We changed it to lobbying. And so lobbying for us is, of course, perfectly legal, and we can't imagine the system working without it. So what we have is institutionalized bribery. So you can bet that in Guatemala, there was some lobbying going on with these journalists and these politicians selected by Bernays. He also conveniently was involved in an anti-American demonstration. Some say he actually orchestrated the anti-American demonstration, which, of course, we've all seen those on the news in a third world country. Um, Nothing gets us terrified and fired up like some other country protesting America. And that's wonderful fodder for the media to spread all over and, put in front of the TV sets of Americans to get them scared. And he even created a fake independent news agency called Middle American Information Bureau. And he bombarded the American media with reports, with press releases, all of those bits to influence the narrative and create his own narrative. And of course, that would be about communism, anti-Americanism, and so on and so forth. Definitely not about United Fruit Company losing its control over some other country's economy. Now enter the CIA. Until this point, we've been talking about a big business trying to manipulate public sentiment. Now we're going to bring in the CIA. So remember I said that these are all declassified documents that you can look up. So you would want to look up PB Success, Operation PB Success, as far as CIA operations. So they got Eisenhower on board. Politicians are unusually susceptible to this kind of propaganda, especially when the public cares and the media is spreading, anti-American protests. Well, of course, the politicians are going to take a stand that, we're against this and we're going to take action. And he authorizes the CIA to stage a coup d'état. In other words, overthrow the leadership of that government, democratically elected or not. And they do it. Agent Howard Hunt, you can look that up, is in charge. He happens to be one of the later Watergate burglars. The CIA overthrows Arbenz, the democratically elected leader who was implementing these reforms to help his people and return the land to his own people, and they installed General Carlos Castillo Armas and reestablishes the military regime, which is what we prefer in our third world partnerships. Again, military dictators are unbelievably easy to work with. Much easier to please one person than to work diplomatically with an entire country's government. So Bernays sells this to the public in the way that all of these activities in all episodes throughout the CIA's history have been sold to the public. How do we always sell our foreign interventions to the public? It's a liberation. It's a liberation of a communist or socialist or oppressive government. So we're doing it for the people. We're basically, living out a second episode of the American Revolution, and people love it. The Guatemalans that we worked with to overthrow the government weren't a minority. They were freedom fighters. It was a grassroots effort, and we just came alongside and helped them to overthrow an evil dictator. And so people don't care. The people who are listening can't figure it out. Remember, we're dealing with an American population who is not equipped and does not have the time or the experience to properly interpret all of the information they have coming at them. And so, of course, none of this is really, they're not competent to criticize this. All they know is that the United States is heroically aiding the liberation of people in Guatemala, helping out some freedom fighters who are pretty much just like the American patriots who established liberty in America. So, after establishing or reestablishing a military dictator, Guatemala has been ruled by U.S.-backed military regimes all the way until 1996. You can imagine the consequences this had on the development of Guatemalan social life and economy in the future decades. And when I was first gathering these notes, this was at that time when there was a bunch of refugees gathering at the border, and one of the places that they were from was Guatemala. There was a whole bunch of Guatemalan refugees a few years ago at the border. And it was so ironic, knowing all of this stuff, that we basically captured and obliterated their ability to govern themselves and supported dictators who were not going to seek the interests of the people if they ever conflicted with the United States interests. And what the American public was saying, or being taught to say at that time, there's all these Guatemalan refugees at the border. And of course, what I hear in the street is, well, why don't they fix their own country? They're coming here because we have it so good. The, you know, it's their fault. They destroyed their country. They have no ability to self-govern. So it's not our fault that they're, can't take care of themselves. Go home and build your own country, which is, hilarious given the facts. So, big question here throughout this episode. Who's the villain? Big government or big business? The answer is neither, because they're the same. There's a name that you could find a lot about if you Googled it, John Foster Dulles. He was the Secretary of State, okay, whose law firm represented United Fruit. So United Fruit Company, whose interest really spurred all of this massive CIA operation, is the law firm representing United Fruit has a member as the Secretary of State of the United States government. Allen Dulles, director of the CIA and board member of United Fruit. Ed Whitman, husband of Eisenhower's personal secretary, principal lobbyist for United Fruit. John Moore's Cabot? So, involved with inter-American affairs, and former president of United Fruit. So the answer, of course, is that it's both. So I guess the real goal here is to get you to be able to think about all of this in a new way, understand your context a little bit better, and perhaps be a little bit less susceptible to propaganda manipulation. It's unavoidable, but so the reasons, why you might want to study propaganda in more depth is freedom. Referring one more time to Ellul, we must not think of the problem of freedom in terms of a choice between being determined and being free. We must say that man is indeed determined, but that it is open to him to overcome necessity, and that this act is freedom. Freedom is not static, it is dynamic, a prize continually to be won. The moment man stops and resigns himself, he becomes subject to determinism. He is most enslaved when he thinks he is comfortably settled in his freedom. The only truly serious attitude is to show them, to rouse them to defend themselves by making them aware of their frailty and their vulnerability instead of soothing them with the worst illusion. So, what worst illusion is he referring to? The worst illusion that you can subject people to is security, mental, physical, or spiritual, that really you cannot have. So the only way to overcome propaganda, you remember at the beginning I talked about how there was this need, there's this individual need that just makes people really, really want what propaganda offers. And you have to deny yourself that. If you're going to be free, you have to deny yourself all of that security, and that's very hard. So that's it. That's the overview of propaganda. Hope you enjoy. I will probably add to this, elaborate on certain connected subjects in separate shorter videos.